Well, hi class, a lot to get through in today's Zoom recording. I want to give just a little bit more instruction on navigating Canvas effectively. I've got a couple comments on the critic speech outlines that you guys all did a pretty good job on. Also too, this week in this week's module, you're covering both visual aids and research. So I want to spend a little time today just talking about how to incorporate sources of evidence and research into an actual speech outline and into the actual conversational flow when you're delivering an actual speech. And then finally, I have an extra credit opportunity that I just posted. I'll cover that as well. But first thing that I want to get into today is the critic speech and the quality of the critic speech outlines. Once you guys got dialed in and really started relying on the sample outlines, excellent job putting those outlines together. And I hope that you're learning that when it comes to public speaking, the quality of the outline has a huge impact on the overall quality of the speech presentation. And so that's a real important aspect of public speaking, what I call speech preparation and learning how to put an outline together. So most of you, really good job. And if you're struggling, or if you struggle with that assignment, just use the sample outlines. You want your outline in terms of the format, the structure, the organization to look exactly like the sample outlines provided. And so you'll have to rely on those even more as we start getting into what I call the academic speeches, both the informative and the persuasive speeches. But before we go any further, what I'd like to do right now is just quickly, some of you are still having some problems in terms of getting your work submitted, and so you'll want to make sure that you're only doing work that you're responsible for. So to illustrate that, let's go ahead and take a look at the modules. Okay, so we're on the modules right now, and I want you to take a look at the week 8 module. That was the module that you just completed last week for the critic speech. Most of you are getting your stuff submitted properly, but a few of you, you were submitting your critic speech to the wrong assignment. And so you want to make sure, again, when you're using Canvas for this class, if you don't see an assignment anywhere in one of the modules, you're not responsible for that. So some of you have the assignment and it's called critic speech video, and you're submitting your critic speech there. And again, I apologize for that. After this week, that should be taken care of. But because I have all of my documents, even stuff that I'm not using for this class, housed on this Canvas shell, and I'm starting a new 8-week class this week, I'm still using some of that stuff to get it copied and pasted onto the new Canvas shell. So that's why you're running into the problem. But just think of it like a textbook, right? You're not responsible for every chapter in the book. You're only responsible for the information that you find on the modules. So you just want to make sure that when you're submitting work, go to the module first, and then click on the assignment for the module. So for the critic speech, right here, submit and view critic speeches, that's the correct module. Some of you, in fact, were having trouble getting your videos uploaded because you can't embed your videos on the other submit the video for the critic speech. So you've just got to make sure that you're submitting your stuff to the right spot. And I think that's the only speech that I still have that I haven't got rid of. Once we get to the informative and the persuasive speeches, you're not going to run into that trouble. But if you did not submit your critic speech here and you submitted it elsewhere, you still need to make sure that you submit and embed your video right here. Submit and view the critic speeches. And I'm going to be grading those all week. I've got over 150 speeches, and so I'm going to be getting through those all week. So certainly, okay, no late penalty. I won't penalize you. Just make sure that you get your critic speech submitted in the right spot, right here, submit and view critic speeches. And as far as the critic speeches go, very impressed with the quality of the outlines. Once you've kind of figured out, use the sample outlines as a guide, those outlines look really, really solid. So good job in terms of the organization and structure. And you want to make sure that you have that down, because as we get to the next speeches, the outlines are just going to get longer. So what I'd like to do next is, let's go ahead and talk about research and public speaking, and more specifically, how to specifically cite a source during an actual speech. Also, too quickly, just by way of review, with the critic speeches and the overall presentation, and again, I'll be grading those all week, but I have seen a few. And the one thing that you really want to make sure you're doing when you're delivering a speech remotely is to create the illusion of eye contact. And so what you really have to do is to make the viewer who's watching, you want to make it seem to the viewer that you're looking right at them. So that means when you're delivering a speech online, remotely, your audience is the camera lens. And so some of you still, your heads are like this, and for a lot of you, you have your outline on the screen, which is fine. I don't mind if you're glancing at that, but I don't want you looking into the screen reading the speech. In fact, you've got to be careful of that, because we can kind of see the reflection of the page on your eyes sometimes, and you can actually kind of see the student kind of following and reading. So to get out of that and to create the illusion of eye contact, your eyes must be focused on the camera. Now, certainly okay to glance down, find your next point. That's why I don't like using the screen, because then it's more like this and then like this. I would rather go ahead and have the glance down and then look back up and deliver the line into the camera. And for the critic speech, I just wanted 50% eye contact. So with a lot of you, that's going to be the area to work on. And it just takes a while to get used to speaking into the camera, because our eyes are automatically drawn to the screen. So we've got to make sure we get that eye contact dialed in. Now, what I want to talk about next is learning how to incorporate research into a speech. And that's important, because a lot of you, most of your public speaking is going to be in the classroom. And for a lot of us, once we transfer from community college, we get to the 4-year level. It depends on the major, but with most disciplines, you'll be focusing more on giving presentations and writing papers than regurgitating information back in the form of a test or exam. And the reason why, once you transfer, now you're in your junior and senior year, so you are contributing to the major instead of just listening to what your instructors have to say. That's kind of a nice little shift. Your first 2 years, you're taking in information, but then your last 2 years, you're pretty much just focusing on your major. So you're probably going to give more presentations and speeches than you, or excuse me, more presentations and writing papers than you are right now. So you really want to make sure that you know how to incorporate research into a presentation, because when you're in college, most of the time, you're required to have a certain amount of evidence and research to support what it is that you're speaking about. And so what we will learn to do in the next speech assignment, that will be the informative speech. We'll get to that next week, and I'll cover the outline for that and all of the little nuances you'll find with the outline for the informative and the persuasive speeches. They're a little bit longer. We give you more freedom as far as coming up with ideas for your main points. You're not going to have the main points assigned anymore like you did with the critic speech. And you're going to find that you're going to have to incorporate research into those speeches. In fact, both those speeches, you'll be required to cite a minimum of 4 different sources during the actual flow of the speech. And so that's a real important aspect of learning about public speaking, is to learn how to incorporate research into a speech outline, and how to incorporate source citations of that research during the actual flow of a speech. So the first thing that I want you to realize, when it comes to citing a source in a speech, you're always going to focus on three components of the source: the title of the publication, the author, and the date. It's why I like creating source citations for public speaking way better than in a paper, because you don't have to include as much information, right? Because again, you'll actually be citing the source during the speech. So the longer the source citation is, the harder for you to remember, the harder for the audience to remember. So we're only giving the audience three aspects of any source of evidence that we use in a presentation. That's the title of the publication or the title of the website, the author, and the date. Those three components. And again, we're actually going to tell the audience through what we call source citations during the flow of the speech, those three specific elements. And so what I've done to kind of help you practice with that is I just posted an extra credit assignment. It's at the very end of this week's module. It's an extra credit assignment. It's really easy. What I ask you to do is come up with an event that happened the year you were born. And all I want you to do for the extra credit is to list that event, and then I want you to give three source citations of research and evidence that either mentioned or described that particular event in detail. In fact, I'll give you an example of that in a second when we go back to the share screen. But understand that learning how to cite your sources correctly on an outline and in a speech, real important aspect of public speaking. And that's going to be one of the big learning components in the next two speeches that we do, the informative and the persuasive speech. Now, let me show you an example of what a source citation looks like in a speech outline. So let's go back to the screen. Okay. So here we have the next module coming up. Here is this week's module where you're focusing on visual aids and how to do college level research. You've got a quiz coming up and the extra credit assignment. I'll get to that in just a bit, but let's go to the week 10, 11, and 13. And I didn't forget 12, that's spring break. And so let's take a look at the modules here. Let's go to the sample speech outline. And so we're going to click on that. And so here for the sample outline for the informative speech that's available on your module, I believe this is an informative speech on the instant replay. All right, so in your informative speech, you will be required to have a minimum of 4 sources in the speech. So that means you're going to incorporate research. You need to have at least 4 different sources of research or evidence to plug into the presentation. And I'll even show you where they go in the outline. Also, to notice in the outline, and I'm going to go over this in much more detail in next week's Zoom recording, but again, you've got the introduction, you've got your body, you have 3 main points instead of 2, and you have your conclusion. For your sources, you'll be required to have 1 source citation in the introduction. And notice here in the intro, we're going to add a segment. We've got our attention getter, our topic sentence, our thesis, and our preview, just like we did with the critic speech, but we're going to add right in the middle of the intro what is called the significance step. Anytime you give a speech and you're going to be speaking for longer than 5 minutes, it's always good to add to the introduction the significance step. And that's where you give the audience a couple reasons why the topic is significant and relevant to the audience. So that's where your first source citation will occur. But notice here how we've incorporated the source right into the flow of the speech. And so here, furthermore, according to Chris Haney in ESPN Magazine, April 17, 2017, and then we give the information from the actual source. So notice, when I am citing a source in a speech, I'm going to give the name of the person who wrote the article. I'm going to give the title of the publication, and I'm going to give the date. So here we have Chris Haney as the author. We have ESPN Magazine as the title of the publication. And please understand this, when you're citing a source, give the title of the publication, not the title of the article, right? And the reason why is the title of the publication is usually shorter than the title of the article. If I have either, I can find the information. But we go with the title of the publication because it's shorter and it's easier to remember. Typically, articles, the titles could be a sentence long, so more for you to remember, more for the audience to remember. So we're giving the title of the publication, or if we're using a website, the title of the website. And then we want to give the full complete date. So I wouldn't say in a 2017 article if it actually was published on a particular date. I always want to give the most specific date possible. But there you see how easy it is to incorporate the source. Notice too, I don't have anything in parentheses. There's no hyperlinks, right? Hyperlinks don't work in a speech outline because the audience doesn't have access to the actual outline. You have a hyperlink there in your outline, the audience isn't going to see it. The only way the audience knows where you got your research is if you tell them during the flow of the speech. So I always like to equate source citations with what I call according to's, right? Because you're going to tell the audience according to title of publication, author, and date, and the order completely up to you. Now, you'll also be required in the informative speech, and you'll have 3 main points instead of 2. You get to come up with your own main points, but I require at least 1 source citation in each of your 3 main points. And realize I'm not putting the source citation right at the top. All right, we're going to focus on the history of replays. Here's where I got all the information. Also too, when I get to the end of the point, right? I don't have, here's where I got my information. I don't have a footnote. I don't have a hyperlink because those do not matter in public speaking. The audience doesn't have access to your outline. So again, the only way the audience knows where you got the information is if you actually tell them. And so you actually write the source citations in to the text of the actual outline. So here we see another source citation. According to Tom Verducci in an article in Sports Illustrated. Notice I'm not giving the title of the article, I'm just giving the title of the publication. And then again, I give the full date, June 7th, 2019. Also too, notice, you always want to cite the source before you give the information from the source. And so kind of what we're doing, we're establishing the credibility of the information before we give that information to the audience. So the according to's always go at the beginning of information from a source, not at the end. Now we'll go to my second main point. Okay, now a little bit different because here I'm relying on a website. So if I'm using information from a website, same deal applies. The only thing that's different, instead of giving the name of the publication, I'm giving the name of the website. So according to NFL.com. And you want to give the name of the website just because it flows a little bit easier. So don't give long web addresses, just tell us the title of the website. But also too, it's a little trickier with websites to find the author and to find the date. So good rule to follow, and you can follow this all the way through college. It's easier than trying to go, well, can I use .com, but I can't use .net? Do I use .edu? Is it better than .gov? No, don't worry about any of the endings or the URLs. All you need to focus on, if you are going to use information from a website, I only use it if I know who said it and when it was said. That makes it way easier. So I always tell students, especially when you're in college, don't go to the internet first to do your research. You want to use publication databases like EBSCOhost, ProQuest, LexisNexis. And if you're not familiar with those, then you want to make sure that you go to our library's webpage and check out all the databases that are available to you for free as a student at Solano. And if you're not familiar with using the library databases, just set up an appointment with a reference librarian. You can even use the next assignment. You could tell the reference librarian, hey, I'm working on an informative speech in Poff's public speaking class. He said something about EBSCOhost and databases. Can you show me how to use those databases? And you'll be able to set up an appointment with a reference librarian. Reference librarians, their job is to help you get your research done. They can easily show you how to navigate the Solana Library webpage and how to gain access to the more than 30-some databases that you have available to you to use for research. So going to Google, going to websites should not be your go-to when it comes to doing college level research. You want to use databases that you know will lead you to information that is actually published, where you'll be able to know who said it and when it was said. But if you find information on a website and you have an author, you have a date, cool. When you cite the source, just give the title of the website rather than the title of the publication. And here we see, according to Steve Smith of NFL.com, last updated on April 17th, 2017. Also, too, a couple different ways to go with the dates. The best way to cite a date for a website is to give the date that the website was last updated. And usually you'll find this on a website on the top right-hand corner. But if you don't, then your second option, and it's not the best option, but it can work, is to give the date that you access the information from the website. We'll see an example of that here. And our third main point, we're using our final source. This is according to an article on ESPN.com by Scott Van Pelt. There was nothing on the ESPN.com website that gave a date that the website was last updated. So I'm just going to use the date that I got the information from the website, last accessed April 17th, 2017. So really, because you can always come up with last access as the date, I only use an internet source if I know who the author of the information is. That's just a good rule to follow. Look, you want to be able to have the best, most reliable, most credible evidence, and the evidence is more credible if we at least know who said it, because now we can check into the qualifications of the source to determine the validity of the source. Can't do that at all if I don't know who said it. So when it comes to citing sources in a speech, we don't use verbal footnotes. We don't have a works cited page. That's cool, right? But we have to make sure that we plug our source citations into the actual text of the outline, and we're actually saying those source citations in the actual speech. That'll take a little bit of time to get used to. If you check out in the persuasive speech module, there's a persuasive speech by Tyler Tuilolo. And it's a really good persuasive speech, but it's a good example of how the student is actually citing those sources during the flow of an actual speech. Okay? All right. So then let's go ahead and go to the extra credit assignment. That's the last thing that I'm going to point out. And this will help you to practice knowing how to determine the key components of a source citation, the title of the publication, the author, and the date. So let's go to the extra credit right now. Okay, so here we're back on the modules. And so for the week 9 module, that's this week's. If you go right down here to the bottom, here's the extra credit assignment. We'll click on that. All right, and here are the instructions. So essentially with the extra credit assignment, I want you to come up with an event that happened the year you were born. And then I want you to simply list that event, and then just list 3 source citations. And all you need here is title of publication, author, and the date, right? All you need are 3 legitimate source citations that either mention or describe the event that happened the year you were born. I was just kind of thinking off the top of my head to give you an example. I know that in 1954, the Giants won the World Series. Oh, you know what? I got to change that. it wasn't the San Francisco Giants, it was actually the New York Giants. So I'll get that fixed. And it's even harder because I'm a Dodger fan. But that's the event that I picked. I was born in 1954. So now, in terms of the extra credit, I just have to list 3 sources that each mention that event. So I went to the New York Times in an article by Red Barber on October 22nd, 1954. Also, I found that mentioned in a book, The History of Baseball by Matt Tucker, published June 8, 1968. And I also found that on the Major League Baseball website in an article by Jonathan Stewart. Because I didn't have the date, it was updated. I went ahead and used the last accessed March 14th, 2021. So for you, for the extra credit, right here, just list an event that happened the year you were born, and then list 3 source citations right here. You have to get all 3 components of the source, and they have to all be correct in order to get the extra credit. All right? All right, last thing. In fact, let's go ahead and go to the screen. All right, and then last thing I want to mention, once we're done with this week's module, then the next couple weeks we're focusing on learning how to do the informative speech, and kind of the same deal that you did with the critic speech. You'll put an outline together, you'll submit your outline, then a week later, so I give you a week between the due date of the outline and the due date of the actual presentation, because I want you to use that time in between to practice your speeches. And I've mentioned that before. You want to be a good public speaker? There's no secret. Just put in the practice, put in the work. And again, good rule to follow. You read your speech out loud from your outline 10 times before the presentation. You're going to have that speech down. And what can really help, try to practice a couple times where you're actually giving your speech to another person, so you kind of get that eye contact, that feedback back. That makes it a little bit more challenging, but that's a good way to practice and prepare for your upcoming speech. But in terms of the informative speech, and I mentioned this a couple weeks before when you were just turning in your topics on the brainstorming assignment, boy, so many of you had so many good topics, and a lot of those topics tended to be more persuasive than informative, that I want to give you the freedom that if you want to do a persuasive topic instead of an informative topic for the informative speech, I'm fine with that. Essentially, you're going to have 2 big speeches that are left after the critic speech. Typically, we do the informative speech and then the persuasive speech, and I let you pick the topics for each of those, but I'm going to widen it even more. It may be that you want to do 2 persuasive speeches rather than the 1 informative. So that means if that's the case, just make sure that you jump ahead to the module on persuasive speaking, and make sure you go over the outline format for the persuasive speech, because the key, we use a different outline format for the informative speech than we do for the persuasive speech. And so you've got to be able to tell the difference between an informative speech and a persuasive speech. To do that, if you go to the topic proposal on the next module coming up for the informative speech, so if you go to that module, look at topic proposal, click on that. There's a really good instructional video where I break down the differences and how to tell the difference between an informative speech and a persuasive speech. You'll also find that there are 2 different kinds of persuasive speeches that we can do as well, but it's all covered in the instructional video that you will find in the module on informative speaking under the heading topic proposal. So that's a good video to go ahead and check out even before we get to the topic selection for the informative speech. So just trying to give you as much freedom as I can. Look, I want you guys talking about the stuff that's important for you, that's important to you. I even noticed on some of the critic speeches, some of you were trying to make that into a persuasive speech. Like, whoa, hold back, I got to pull back on the reins. I like that energy. But we've got a better speech format other than the critic speech outline format that we can use for persuasive speeches. We'll learn that as we move on down the road. Okay, so this week, kind of catching up, getting that research done, learning how to cite your sources, and then starting next Monday, now we get into the big speeches, the informative speech and the persuasive speech. Next Monday's Zoom meeting, I'll cover that outline format in detail for the informative speech. Have a good week, you guys. We'll talk to you soon.